put able-bodied welfare recipients to work at useful community projects in return for their welfare grants.
The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, while the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today. In 1976, they took home only 9%.
Is the future cyberpunk? How would we know if it is? Can this question even be answered? I think an easy answer to the last question is yes, it probably can be, or at least give us a close idea. And I would further argue it is a question that holds far more importance than we might imagine. Yet aside from this can force us to step outside of the purely philosophical and theoretical terrain on its own. This is what is important about art. This is what is important about literature. In this context, maybe we are seeing further confirmation and legitimacy to the idea that literature, art, aesthetics come before philosophy and the philosopher. The artist was born before the philosopher, and in this case, individuals like Philip K. Dick, Mike Pondsmith, and even Andrei Tarkovsky. With the release of the video game Cyberpunk 2077, the emerging interest in the Blade Runner-esque science fiction aesthetic, we can further guess that this emerging interest is not purely commercial. It's arguably deeper than that. There is a further relevancy of this science fiction that makes it far more legitimate compared to worlds such as Star Wars and Star Trek. The world of cyberpunk may quite literally be growing in popularity because it is posing important questions about the future. Yet all science fiction does this, but the thing about cyberpunk is that it is likely among the most accurate depiction of our future compared to prior forms of science fiction. And with the release of arguably the largest video game in the past 5 years, with growing understanding around this plane of science fiction, what a more relevant time to put these questions to the test than this. For that, we will examine primarily the world of Cyberpunk by Mike Pondsmith, and the world that will be showcased in CD Projekt Red's new game Cyberpunk 2077. We will try to examine this from a relevant philosophical, theoretical, and socio-economic lens. For all of the new hype around this game, the emergent interest of this world, I am excited to bring this to you. So let's get started. This is an interesting video for us. This might bring an overlapping audience to us, and for that I will keep this theoretically tame. I will try to make this as easy as possible to follow. When one looks at the world of cyberpunk, the first thing we see is the mass world of privatization. A world where government, a public sector, public services themselves do not really exist. This isn't accidental. The creation of cyberpunk from Mike Pondsmith was being written at the height of the neoliberal movement in the 1980s. For many perhaps unfamiliar, neoliberalism is a newer return to purely market-orientated governing and economics, where we see the mass deregulation of markets, increased power for businesses, corporations, and capital, where we see austerity measures of cutting government programs that help working-class people. It's important to note this is an economic and political theory quite literally endorsed by both political parties in the United States and the majority in Europe. While in the US, with only a small few groups and individuals with political power who fundamentally oppose this framework. This neoliberalism is so pervasive that even after continual market failures and bailouts during economic crashes, it still remains the largest economic baseline today. From the 1980s, it makes perfect sense that Mike Pondsmith found the macroeconomic and political basis of this world, a science fiction where only a handful of corporations govern Night City. The environment reflects this. There are slums everywhere. People are constantly and continually poor. For most, the only available access to healthcare comes from a nonprofit called CityMed, a nonprofit only supported by the large corporations in power, as they understand even a small baseline of care for the poor is necessary for them to still be employees, to still physically make it to work. This privatization extends into the police and military, where the corporations of Arasaka, Militech, and Night Corp own their own practical militaries that would partake in corporate wars that devastated the globe. This easily projects into the US's use of private military forces. Private militaries are continually growing, and just in the Iraq War, we saw a whopping height of 28,686 mercenaries for a total of 85,600 actual GI troops. PMCs and mercenaries made over 1/3 of the forces in Iraq during 2012, and the very growing world of private militaries does not seem like it's going to stop anytime soon. The sheer prophetic material formation of this world goes further. This world showcases a primitive return to instincts, raw instincts away from any enlightenment ideal of reason and a transcendental movement past our purely primitive being. Sex, money, and drugs absolutely rule here. Prostitutes are present nearly everywhere, not necessarily just because of mass poverty, but because of the central ethic of ultimate pleasure. Synthetic drugs are mass-produced, and junkies, rich and poor, are all over Night City, with the large corporations often being behind much of the drug trade. A pre-Enlightenment age of religious spirituality, of religious and sentimental fervor, of the Logos, or a liberal and Enlightenment ideal of reason is gone here. These things are hindrances to the pursuit of pleasure and profit. The very material nature of Night City is completely bleak. It represents this very post-Fordist economic world that we are living in today. An economic world where there are no real factory jobs, there are no line jobs of the Fordist model, but a work past that, of work that is completely spontaneous, that there is no security, and where freelancing and selling is of the utmost importance to your survival. This is where the lens of theory comes in, that with transhumanism. We see this articulated through the world in cyberpunk with mass cybernetics, where most people are just cyborgs by our standard today. Everyone has modifiable cybernetics, attachable weapons, brain chips, etc. With our world today, it has just touched the surface with the philosophical movement of transhumanism, the philosophy of moving human consciousness, intellect, and conditions further with the use of technology. In our world today, we see that the work of Elon Musk's Neuralink, a company dedicated to creating brain implants that operate as an interface. Further, we see AI leading the pack with nearly everything. Machine learning, self-driving cars, AI software with things such as DLSS, ray tracing in video games. Artificial intelligence is just scratching the surface. Yet in Cyberpunk 2077, you can literally communicate with a lifelike sentient vending machine.
Hey there, stranger! I'm Brendan, your friendly neighborhood SCSM, and the nicest AI in all of Night City.
The world of cyberpunk embodies the world of transhumanism, matter of fact to its extreme, yet still within its theoretical reach and future relevancy. Transhumanism and barbaric hedonism are the ultimate idealisms of cyberpunk. It's further than the neoliberal technocratic, perhaps even neo-fascist material nature of cyberpunk. But this idealism spans much further, and the artistic nature and overall aesthetic paint a clear picture of postmodernism. A postmodernism beyond itself. This can be viewed through the lens of Frederick Jameson and, more potently, Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher often talks about lost futures and the slow cancellation of the future. This passage from Mark Fisher's Ghost of My Life give a small illustration of recycled aesthetics and what he means by the cancellation of the future. No matter what the causes for this temporal pathology are, it is clear that no area of Western culture is immune from them. The former redoubts of futurism, such as electronic music, no longer offer escape from formal nostalgia. Music culture is in many ways paradigmatic of the fate of culture under post-Fordist capitalism. At the level of form, music is locked into pastiche and repetition. But its infrastructure has been subject to massive, unpredictable change. The old paradigms of consumption, retail, and distribution are disintegrating, with downloading eclipsing the physical object, record shops closing, and cover art disappearing. For many who may be new here, this may be a little complex. Mark Fisher talks about how in our 21st century world, art is continually recycled. New art is made from the vein of the 70s, the 80s, or the 90s. Nothing is truly new anymore. Art is too taxing on its own. Capitalism, constant selling, and productivity continually forces us to sell recycled art because it's easier and more profitable that way. To truly create is way too inefficient. Thus, the future is suspended. From a conceptual and phenomenological standpoint, we cannot interact with the future anymore. This cannot be clearer in cyberpunk. Its world is a mishmash collage of prior artistic flavors of the 20th century, of late neon science fiction aesthetics, of futuristic yet Gotham City dystopian-like set pieces. Here in Night City, the world of cyberpunk, the future is actually suspended. I have tried to do a decent job of painting the world of cyberpunk in a theoretical lens, and elaborating on some of its lore and its juxtaposed position to our current world today. If you guys want to learn more about this world, please go check out the Neon Arcade's 2-part video series on cyberpunk's lore. The link will be in the description. But the question still stands, is cyberpunk the future? Of course, nearly every other YouTube channel would say, that's for you to decide. I absolutely hate that, by the way, so I'm not going to do that. So to cut it to you straight and tell you what I think, you are obviously here because of that. The ultimate short answer to this is yes, probably so. Cyberpunk is likely the future, as devastating as that is. I cannot truly think of a world that is more potently relevant than the setting Mike Pondsmith has created. The material nature and aesthetic of the future may be much prettier than the depressing, bleak aesthetic of Night City, but the barbaric idealism of larger neoliberal, technocratic corporate control, a potential predatory capitalistic corporate takeover of transhumanism, is pretty likely. This isn't to say that this prediction will be 100% correct, rather that this science fiction world is arguably the most relevant, with a very political world that likely inspired cyberpunk becoming even more relevant in 2020. Things like the neoliberal revolution in the 1980s and further corporate control. I cannot help but think cyberpunk was created as an artistic warning sign of the future to come, and for that we must heed its warning. I find cyberpunk to be among the most dystopian, but sadly and regrettably, the most relevant. As corporate neoliberal hegemony and control of the loss of social programs and further austerity, ideas of the future, relevancy of private militaries, further corporate governance, ultimately become far more relevant as time goes on. Perhaps the best thing we can do is let this be a warning to us all. Thank you guys very much for watching and making it to the end. This is quite a different video for us, but I thought this topic was incredibly interesting, so hopefully it still proves useful to you all. As always, I have another huge request. Absolutely none of this would be possible without our patrons and YouTube members. Pledging whatever you can helps immensely, and we now have a membership tab on YouTube with the exact same perks and benefits as Patreon. Another decent way to support the channel is to head over to our Twitch and sub via your Amazon Prime account. It's completely free, but only do this if you're not already subbed to someone else or you watch streams on Twitch, because I've moved over to YouTube for my streaming. But for anyone who doesn't use it and it's just laying dormant, it gives me a couple dollars a month and it helps out immensely. And last but not least, bookmarking our Amazon affiliate link and using it whenever you make purchases helps us out immensely, and it doesn't cost you any extra. Little things like this add up a lot and keep this channel alive. Again, thank you guys very much, and I hope to see you in the next one.